Hello folks, this is David Hurley of EasyChessTips.com, and in this video I'm going to have a look at where I went wrong in the opening of this game, playing 1d4 and playing against what turned out to be the King's Indian defense. Now I'm building a chess opening repertoire for white memory system based on what's called the major system, in which I create a code word which links to a number in my repertoire of a particular opening variation. And the King's Indian begins in my system at variation 51, which I call the lute. And there are 4 or 5, I think there are 4 variations. There's the lute, the lane, the lamb, and the lorry. There are 4 key variations. However, once we moved out of the first variation, I got lost. I wasn't even thinking actually about my repertoire, because this was a casual game online. That's actually not a very good excuse. I should be working on my repertoire all the time. But as soon as we went out of the one which I'm most familiar with, which is the lute, the 51st variation, I got lost and played some terrible moves. So I want to show you where I went wrong and what I should have done according to my memory system, which is based on a strategic chess opening repertoire for white by John Watson. I basically extracted a large number of the variations from this book and plugged them into a memory system, which I have not yet perfected, as we will see. So let me just show you what variation 51 in my memory system is, because it's the baseline that I use to remember the opening moves of the King's Indian. So I play 1d4, and we have this move signaling the King's Indian, and there we have the King's Indian in all its glory. These moves are all part of what I call the lute, the 51st in my opening repertoire, the 51st variation. Until we come to this E5 move, we move out of the lute, which actually I was going to show you, wasn't I? So in the lute, my opponent would have played C5, we advance, then we get E6, then I pull out the knight to F3, E takes D5, E takes D5. The rook moves over, pinning the bishop to the king. So we put out bishop to D3. He then whips out the old bishop to H6. This bishop still can't move. We castle, unpinning the king. Bishop takes, pawn takes. And this looks like a freebie pawn. It looks like a free pawn, but if black gobbles up that pawn, black can get into some trouble. It opens the way to quite a strong white attack if you know what you're doing. And so an experienced player up against an experienced player, somebody better than me, would probably not do that, but perhaps move the queen over to E7. We then advance the pawn, so it's now protected by the bishop and the knight while strengthening the center. We then come here to the end of the 13th move, and now to complete my variation, the 51st variation in my memory system, which I call the lute, we move queen to E2. That is the basic tabia for the opening variation in the King's Indian series of 4 variations that I have plugged into a memory system. Now, it's called the lute. L signifies the number 5 and T signifies the number 1. So it reminds me of the position in my memory system. But by chance, there's a couple of nice little coincidences. This is a 14-move variation that I remember, and I think it's called the Thiabo lute. It's a 14-stringed lute. So remembering that helps me to remember how many moves I'm aiming to get to in my opening variation. And the other thing is, you can you can create the appearance of a loot. If you use your imagination, you can see a loot on the board. Here is the neck with that the top, which comes across like so, that angled top of the neck, and here is the main body of the loot. So it's almost as if we're plugging the queen in to complete the neck of the loot in the 14th move of the 14-string Thiabo loot in my memory system. So that's how we do that. But as we saw, my opponent did not play the c5 move. And that is not a problem. And it didn't cause me a problem. He played the e5 move. So we move out of loot into the next part of the variation, that is number 52. 2 is signified by n. So I call this variation lane. L equals 5 and n equals 2. So the lane, and I imagine that this e5 move opens up a nice lane here for black to advance down or stroll down, should he so wish. We then advance. That's perfectly in line with the lane. We then have this move, knight to h6. And it's at this point that I go to sleep. I forget that this is one of the variations. It could be the lane. It could also be the last one, called the last one in the system. No, it's either the lane or the lamb. It's either the 52nd or the 53rd variation, depending on what black does. Now, of course, black has more than 2 options here and could do something quite different, which, if I know my repertoire well, which should be a kind of signal to me that black is perhaps doing something not recommended by John Watson in his book on the 1d4 opening repertoire. So when something happens that is not in the repertoire that I've set up, that rings a little alert bell if I am awake. Sadly, in this game, I was not awake. Now, the repertoire move to play here, if you're playing the lane or indeed the lamb, is knight to f3. I have it here just to make sure. We have lane, we have e5, followed by d5, knight to h6, knight to f3. This is John Watson's recommendation at this stage in the game. But I did not play that. I played a move that at this stage is unnecessary, and that was a3. We'll talk about why it's unnecessary. Let's talk about why it's unnecessary. So let's move that back, go back 1. I moved a3, hoping to prevent the knight from coming down here to b4. But b4 is not actually the knight's intended destination, I should think. Let's say I play the better move, and the knight comes down here. As you can see, there's absolutely no threat from this knight. He's not going to take the pawn, or well, he can if he wants to. He's not going to drop in here, or take this pawn. So now, if the knight were to do that, or if the player were to play his knight to b4, now is the moment when I simply can usher the knight back to where he came from. So it's basically a lost tempo on black's part. I was defending myself against black playing some move in which he would lose a tempo. So it was a superfluous move. a3 I played too early in this variation. I should have played knight to f3. Now, this is what happened. I played a3. It gives him, my opponent, equality. And my opponent was then able to play his intended move, or could have played his intended move. He comes in with this move, and I now play another move that is out of the repertoire and not playing to where I should be going with this repertoire, with this particular opening. Let's have a look at if black, after I play, instead of this move, if I play knight to f3, black does indeed come into this square here, which is his target square. It looks as if black is targeting, well, black is targeting this e4 pawn with the knight and the knight. And we have protecting the pawn, just the knight on c3. So there are two possible moves, really. Well, three it seems. Lichess is probably more if I turn on the engine in full. This is the recommended move. Queen to c3 is the recommended move by John Watson to protect this pawn. Now the pawn is doubly protected. And that is the end of that particular tabiat. That is the tabiat we're aiming for in the setup, which I call the lane. But I forgot about all that and played that weak a3 move. That was not necessary. Here, totally unnecessary move. Now we are out of the repertoire, so we're now playing just by analyzing the board, and my analysis was very poor. Now, when the knight comes over here, the two knights here resemble the 53rd variation in my memory system, which is called the lamb. And I will show you how that repertoire goes. It's played a bit differently. This move doesn't come in so quickly. In the lamb, we have this variation here. So once now I make my knight f3 move, my opponent will move over here. That is the lamb, knight to f3, knight to h5. And now that the knight has moved away from attacking this pawn, we can indeed move a3 in preparation were the knight to come in here. There's only one knight attacking now, one piece attacking and one piece defending. We can now usher away the knight once again. He might choose to take. Why would he do that? If we take, he's going to advance. Okay, so he's sacrificing a knight for space. So that would be a better way to play. Let's have a look at how I played. It was very poor. Okay, so far, now we have this move, and the move I needn't have played, the superfluous a3, not necessary. And it allows my opponent, this also is not needed at this stage, it allows my opponent to get in. So here you see I'm not developing my piece. I ought to have developed, but I didn't. The engine is thinking about that move. I now play a very weak move. This is a losing move. One weakness I have is a kind of fixation on getting onto this diagonal and nobbling this bishop here. In short, playing on the king's side, where what I should be doing, it seems, well, what I should be doing in most situations is using the queenside space and using it quickly. This is a terrible setup. It's a losing setup. I mean, I was just, what was I doing? I let him have the rook. And from here, my position is now so full of holes, you could water a garden with it. And that is as far, I think, as we have got. Oh no, there are a couple more terrible moves. Okay, so this is basically a lost position unless my opponent really screws things up. So the moral of the story is that if you're going to create a memory system, you really need to work on it so that you don't make elementary mistakes in the opening few moves. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. Catalogue of blunders on my part. That's all for me, David Hurley of EasyChessTips.com.